What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're looking at the final game played between Gukesh and Praggnanandhaa in the tiebreaks of the 2025 Tata Steel Chess Tournament Finals. This game was insane. Again, it's a blitz game. It's a tiebreak game to see who wins the entire tournament. This was the last tiebreak game, meaning the winner of this game wins the whole thing. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Praggnanandhaa is playing as white. He opens 1d4, black goes d5, then we have knight f3, knight f6, and in this blitz game, as Praggnanandhaa often does in blitz, he heads for the London system with the move bishop to f4. Now here, what is black going to do in response? Well, Gukesh is a big aficionado of the very solid line where you go for a fast e6, then c5, and then potentially queen b6 or bishop d6. Here we go. In the game, e6, then e3, then c5, and now here the main line continues. Knight d2, then queen b6, then rook b1, defending the pawn on b3, and so on. But instead of the main line here in this game, Praggnanandhaa, he plays the move bishop e2. Now this move is a very curious move. I believe Ding Liren actually played it himself against Gukesh D in the 2024 World Chess Championships. Now the idea behind it, instead of going knight d2, you play sort of a weird waiting move to try to throw black off guard. What will black do about it? Well, he just goes bishop d6, a perfectly fine move. Now here, white does trade on c5. D takes c5, giving black the option. Do you want to take back that pawn on c5, or do you want to capture the free bishop on f4? Well, in the game, he does take on c5. Bishop takes c5 is the move. Of course, if you take on f4, then you will be down a pawn after bishop takes, then e takes, and that is not a good idea by any means. So instead, bishop takes c5 played in the game. Now here we have castles for both sides, castles and castles, and now here white plays the very typical queen's gambit move, c4, launching that c pawn 2 squares up. And now here, let's slow down and do inventory. What do we have so far in this opening phase of the game? Well, unlike a traditional London system, here the game is opening up very, very rapidly, and it's sort of like a queen's gambit decline position where white has his 2 bishops on very good squares, e2 and f4. Meanwhile, black, his problem piece is that bishop on c8. Now, if black can find a good square for the bishop, potentially on b7 after a6, then b5, or potentially on c6 after bishop d7, then c6, then black will be doing fine. However, as long as his bishop lacks a good home, white is going to have some chances to maybe fight for a small advantage out of the opening. Now here, black has a variety of responses he can do here. For example, you can take on c4, you can develop the knight, and so on. But in the game, black plays the strongest and most solid option. That is just d takes c4, trading off that pawn. And now, of course, we have the severe tension between these queens on d1 and d8. And what is white going to do about it? Well, for now, he ignores the tension and just goes bishop takes c4, winning back that pawn. Now, material once again is even. The queens may come off the board. And again, the big imbalance in this position is the bishop on c8 versus the one on f4. And that, of course, is to white's advantage. And what will black do here? Well, he goes a6, intending potentially a fast b5, ignoring the tension of the queens. And here Praggnanandhaa says, you know what? We're finally going to trade queens off the board. Queen takes d8 is the move, the queen trade, and then we have rook takes d8 and then knight b d2. Now here, again, Gukesh, if he can just get those queens off the board, he will be doing just fine. If he can just find a good square for his light squared bishop, he will be doing just fine. And the easiest, most straightforward way to do that is to go b5, driving back that bishop, and then going bishop b7. That would be the simplest, most straightforward option. But instead here, bishop d7 was chosen. The idea being potentially he wants to go bishop c6 and then knight 8 d7 behind it. That would also be a reasonably harmonious setup. But here white goes rook a c1, lining up pressure against that bishop on c5. Now the threat is bishop takes e6 with the discovered attack of the rook on the bishop on c5. If white can get that in, that would be absolutely devastating for black's cause. Therefore, bishop e7 was chosen in the game by Gukesh, simply defending that bishop. Now we have bishop e2. White also retreats, opening up the scope of the rook on the c-file, and now one potential threat could be bishop c7. Now that move right now is not threatening anything major besides poking at that rook on d8, but again, it could be a threat later in the game. Now here, black goes knight d5, defending c7 and also pressuring the bishop on f4. The bishop must go somewhere. In the game, bishop g3 chosen. Now, I do want to point out, you can still go bishop c7 here. For example, bishop c7, and even if black takes on c7, knight takes, then rook takes. Yes, black has the bishop pair, those b's on d7 and e7. However, white has a very active rook on c7. He's pressuring the pawn. He's ready for rook fc1 next, and so on. And overall, white would have enough compensation for that missing bishop pair, and overall, bishop c7 may even be the strongest move in that position. But instead here, bishop g3, chosen by Praggnanandhaa, keeping things safe and solid in this blitz game. Now here, Gukesh plays a very provocative move. He lashes out with the bishop, and he plays the move bishop b5. Now, why do I say this is a provocative move? Well, it's very simple. Here, black is willing to accept doubled pawns. White has the option of going bishop takes b5 immediately, and then black will be forced to recapture with the a pawn, at which point black would have two very weak isolated pawns on the b file on the queen side, and that is what happens. So bishop takes b5, then a takes b5, and again, black's pawns on b5 and b7 are very, very weak. So why the heck did black do this? Well, the truth is the pawns cannot be attacked very easily, and the rook has a lot of activity on the open a file, and those two factors do make up for the weakness of those pawns on the queen side. Now here, of course, white must do something about the defense of the pawn on a2. Here, white goes a3, a very simple move, and black goes knight to c6, developing his knight out onto the queen side. Now from here, we have rook fd1, sliding the rook over, then rook a to c8, and then king to f1. White is also sliding his king over closer to the center of the board. Now here, black goes knight b6, retreating his knight. White goes knight e4, jumping up with the knight and opening up the tension between these rooks on the e file. Now here, black goes knight c4, jumping up with the knight, pressuring b2. What is white going to do about it? Well, first he trades rooks. Rook takes d8, and here black has a very important choice. How do you recapture the rook? Of course, there are 1, 2, 3 pieces all attacking the rook. Which piece do you recapture with? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the right recapture. It's not as simple as it seems at first glance. That is my one hint for you. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one, featuring Praggnanandhaa, Gukesh, the whole Indian gang, and so on. Here, black goes rook takes d8 in the game, but this turns out to be a very significant mistake. Instead, knight takes d8 is the right response. The problem with rook takes d8 is here, white can simply go for the very strong move a4. This move is so strong because it removes the defender of that knight on c4. For example, if white were to go a4, this was not played in the game, but it is the strongest move. The threat is very simple. If black takes on a4, then you take the hanging knight on c4. And if you don't take on a4, white will just take on b5 next anyway, again, removing the defender of that knight on c4. So overall, a4 is a very strong response strong move in response to rook takes d8, the slightly inaccurate move. Now here, white, instead of a4, he goes rook c2, trying to defend the pawn on b2. However, here, black, he finds a very good way to get counterplay going immediately. He flies down with the rook d1, Gukesh playing very active. Then we have king to e2, and then rook b1, sliding over with the rook and pressuring that very weak pawn on b2. Now we have knight c3. Praggnanandhaa dropping back with the knight, pressuring the rook, and also pressuring that weak pawn on b5. That is the key idea here. Yes, you do lose that pawn on b2, but in return, you will be winning that pawn on the b5 square. Now we have rook takes b2, then rook takes, knight takes, and knight takes b5. White ultimately wins that pawn on the b5 square, and what is black going to do? Well, here he goes knight c4, dropping back with the knight, defending a3. So far, so good by Gukesh, but now here white, of course, has some options. The strongest move, once again, is simply a4, getting the pawn out of the attack of both the knight and the bishop and bolstering that knight on a5. So a4 would be the strongest move here. Instead of that, king d3 chosen in the game, pressuring the knight. The idea being, yes, Black can win that pawn on a3 with the knight. However, this pawn on b7 is also likely to fall in the near future, and white should be relatively okay. From here, we have knight takes a3, then knight takes, then bishop takes. Black is officially up a pawn, but again, with white's king being so active, that pawn on b7 is likely to fall sooner or later. Now we have king to c4, marching up with the king, and here it turns out the strongest move for black is simply bishop e7, getting that bishop to a better square. Instead, knight a7 chosen in the game, and now white goes bishop b8, pressuring the knight. White being very active. All right, knight c8 chosen by Gukesh. Now king b5. The march of the king continues, and here black has a very strong move that effectively keeps the one pawn advantage if he can find it. And again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for black right here in this exact position. All right, the key idea, it's very simple. Bishop d6, you drop back with the bishop. The point being, if white takes on d6, then you take with the knight, and overall, you're doing just fine. For example, bishop d6, the key move. If white goes bishop takes, black takes with the knight, and then if you try to attack the knight, say, I don't know, king c5, then black can always retreat, and black suddenly has all of these squares being covered by the pawn and the knight. I mean, white's king is literally blocked off from advancing. Black can always go b6 later and so on, and black would be doing just fine. Now, instead of this, here black goes for the Ben-Feingold counterattack, f6, gaining space in the center and controlling the e5 square, stopping future knight to e5 ideas. Now we have knight d2, dropping back with the knight, then king to f7, knight c4, jumping up with the knight and pressuring that bishop on a3. Then bishop f8 is the move, dropping back with the bishop, then knight to a5, pressuring b7 yet again, then bishop d6, finally offering that bishop trade. Now we do have the bishop coming off the board. Bishop takes, then knight takes, then king b6, and now that pawn on b7. Based on some inaccurate moves by Gukesh, that pawn is as good as gone. There is just no good way to save it, to keep it alive. So here black goes knight e4, jumping up with the knight, abandoning the pawn on b7, and counterattacking on the weak pawn on f2. Now we have f3, driving back the knight, knight to c3, king takes b7, and then e5, black gaining more space in the center of the board. Then we have king to c6, knight d1, pressuring that pawn on e3, then knight c4, defends the pawn on e3, and then we have the move king to e6, centralizing the king. Now e4. Now we officially have a symmetrical pawn structure in the center of the board, but don't worry, this was a decisive game. White or black is going to win this game and the entire tournament despite the symmetrical looking pawn structure. All right, now g6 is the move for Gukesh. G6. My computer's not working. G6 is the move. Now king to c5. White dropping back with the king, and then f5. Gukesh playing very active, gaining space and threatening f takes e4, trying to liquidate two pawns off the board. Now we have king to b4, and sure enough, f takes e4 and f takes e4 was played. Now knight f2, the knight dropping back and pressuring the pawn on e4. Of course, white will have to defend. Knight d2 chosen, but here black already, he's got a slightly better placed king and a slightly better placed knight. That means Gukesh right now so far is in the driver's seat in this game. All right, Gukesh, king d6 was the move. Then we have knight c4, jumping up, pressuring the king, king e6 chosen, knight d2, king f6. Now Gukesh trying to go this way over to the king side. King c4 chosen by Praggnanandhaa, my favorite Indian superstar. Then knight g4, dropping back and pressuring the weak pawn on h2. Knight f1 again defends the pawn. Praggnanandhaa so far managing to hang on, but it's not a very pretty sight. Now knight f2 again pressuring e4. Praggnanandhaa again must defend. In the game, king d5 chosen, defending with the king instead of the knight with the move knight d2. Now we have knight d3, again eyeing perhaps f4. Knight f4 would hit the king and the pawn on g2. That would be enough to win the game effectively. Therefore, knight to e3 is forced, defending the pawn on g2 in advance of that knight jump. Now, sure enough, we have the knight jump anyway. Knight f4, king d6, and here, in this position, so far, this endgame has been incredibly equal for such a long time. And here, finally, in this position, Black makes a critical blunder that throws away the game. Here, the only good move for Black is going to be h5. That is the key idea. Otherwise, he's virtually in some sort of zugzwang, as White is threatening ideas like knight d5, trying to chase away the king and win the pawn on d5. Therefore, h5 is the key move. Again, if you move the king literally anywhere, the pawn on e5 falls. And if you move the knight anywhere, let's say, I don't know, d2, then knight d5 hits the king and you gobble up that pawn on d5. So h5 is the key move here. Instead, though, in the game, Gukesh, he goes knight d3. Now, this move makes some sense. After all, the knight does defend the pawn on e5. However, as you can see by the eval bar just skyrocketing on the left side of your screen, here White has a winning idea. And again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for White right here, right now. And it's not even that complicated. Here, the key idea, of course, is knight g4, hitting the king and the pawn. And very importantly, the king will no longer be able to defend the pawn on e5. The king must move. In the game, king g5 chose logical enough, but now knight takes e5. And look at this. We have a knight endgame where Praggnanandhaa, despite being down for most of this endgame, here he is suddenly completely winning. And if Black takes the knight, if he goes knight takes e5, he did not do this in the game, but if he does, if he goes knight takes e5, White takes the knight, and then he simply goes king d6 and marches the pawn all the way up the board to the e8 square. There is just nothing Black can do to stop that pawn. Instead here, king to f4 chosen by Gukesh. He has to keep the game going, but in doing so, he gives up the knight. Knight takes d3 chosen, Gukesh wins the pawn, and now here Gukesh is literally down a knight in this blitz game, but he continues fighting on. Knight f2 hits the king, king to e3 hits the knight, knight g4, then king to f4 again hits the knight, but now knight f6, the knight retreats, it pressures h7, Black goes h5, now king e6, then h4, Gukesh, he continues to fight on till the bitter end, you gotta love it. King f7 chosen, the king targeting the pawn on g6, then king f5, king g7, g5, h3, king to f4, and here the final move of the game is just king to g6. And look at this. The king has to move, and no matter where it moves, you lose that pawn on g5. And if the king doesn't move, the only other idea is g5. And again, knight takes g4, sorry, and then knight takes g4 would win that pawn on the spot. No matter what, Gukesh is losing to Praggnanandhaa, and for that reason, he resigns on the spot, and he gives up his chances of winning Tata Steel 2025, and instead, Praggnanandhaa, the swindler, he wins the first major super tournament of the year. I've been calling it all tournament long. I mean, you guys know I've been hyping up Praggnanandhaa so far in this tournament, and look at what he just did. My favorite Indian superstar, Praggnanandhaa, he wins the whole shebang. I'm so proud. I can't wait to see how many rating points he gains starting in February. As soon as this tournament is over, I mean, I imagine his live rating is going to be just through the roof, and this guy deserves it. He played some unbelievable chess at this tournament, beating the likes of Fabiano Caruana and many other players to win the whole thing. So, wow, very impressive stuff. Comment down below what you thought of this game between Praggnanandhaa and Gukesh, and especially the tournament in general. I mean, what a tournament this was, with Praggnanandhaa coming out on top, but Gukesh also, I mean, tying for first place prior to the tiebreaks. Gukesh is notoriously not good at blitz. When I say not good, he's only rated 26-15 in blitz, which is very, very low for a world champion. I mean, most world champions are like, you know, 2,800 plus ELO and blitz. So it's very surprising. Magnus Carlsen says Gukesh is a very deep calculator. He likes to calculate very, very deep, but he doesn't have the same level of intuition as most other top grandmasters, which makes him a little bit worse in blitz. So very interesting combination. I guess Praggnanandhaa also a little bit weaker in blitz, but not nearly to the same extent as Gukesh. But anyways, regardless, very incredible game, incredible stuff. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and the tournament in general. So again, comment down below what you thought. And if you want to see another shocking game played between Praggnanandhaa and Gukesh, check out this video right here, where again, I cover one of their most shocking games ever from the 2024 Candidates Tournament. That game was simply unbelievable. Praggnanandhaa, I mean, he melts my heart with I believe it was a triple pawn sacrifice out of the opening to attack the black king. If you want to see a crazy game again, check that video out, and I'll see you in the next video.